Are you ready to blow your mind about medieval history? For too long, the stories of brave, fierce women who fought in the rough and tumble world of the Middle Ages have been hidden, misunderstood, or just plain forgotten. Did women really just stay home and weave tapestries while men went off to war? Were they too delicate to pick up a sword or wear heavy armor? It is time to get real about what medieval women actually did on the battlefield from the 5th to the 15th centuries. Number one myth: any woman who fought was an extreme exception or an outcast. Many people think that if a woman picked up a weapon in medieval times, she must have been a unique oddity, a person so outside the social norm that she was practically a historical anomaly. This idea suggests that such a woman was perhaps unstable or pushed into an impossible situation that made her an absolute one-off. Yet, historical records tell a more nuanced story. While it is true that professional soldiery was primarily a male domain, the lines between civilian and combatant, particularly during times of widespread conflict or localized violence, were often blurry for everyone, including women. Consider the diverse roles women held in medieval society. Noble women managed vast estates, which often included castles and fortified manors. These women were not just passive figures. They were responsible for the defense of their lands, their household, and their vassals when their husbands or male relatives were away on campaign, at court, or deceased. This was not a rare occurrence, but a fundamental aspect of their aristocratic duty. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance, a powerful queen, traveled extensively and was deeply involved in political and military affairs, though she did not directly lead troops into battle herself. However, her influence and the necessity for noblewomen to secure their holdings meant that they supervised, trained, and sometimes even directly participated in defensive actions. The Countess of Montfort, Jeanne de Penthièvre, stands as a strong counterexample to the idea of the extreme exception. During the Breton War of Succession in the 14th century, after her husband was captured, Jeanne did not retreat. Instead, she took command, actively leading her forces, riding armored through towns to inspire her troops, and even engaging in direct sorties against enemy sieges. She defended Hennebont with such ferocity that she personally rallied the women of the town to break up enemy siege engines with stones and engage in direct assaults. Her actions were recorded by chroniclers like Jean Froissart, who detailed her courage and leadership without portraying her as a strange outcast, but rather as a formidable opponent and a brave lady. Beyond the nobility, peasant women and urban women also found themselves in situations demanding armed participation. Medieval life was hard, and localized conflicts, raids, and brigandage were common. Villages and towns often had to defend themselves. Chroniclers occasionally mention women participating in these defensive efforts, not as singular oddities, but as part of a collective community response. For example, during the Hussite Wars in Bohemia in the 15th century, women were recorded fighting alongside men. These were not noble women with extensive training, but ordinary people defending their homes and religious beliefs. They were not seen as outcasts for this, but as essential members of the community engaged in a life or death struggle. Accounts describe women pushing stones from castle walls, pouring hot pitch on attackers, and even engaging in direct combat with improvised weapons. Their participation was a grim necessity, but it was also a recognized reality rather than a shocking aberration. Urban women, particularly during sieges, also played direct roles. City defenses relied on every able-bodied person. Women assisted in logistics, carried ammunition, cared for the wounded, and often took up arms themselves. Records from cities like Siena or Florence during internal conflicts or external threats describe women contributing to the defense. These were not unique individuals singled out for their eccentricity, but citizens participating in the defense of their city. Their involvement was often presented as a testament to civic unity and courage, rather than an act of an individual anomaly. Furthermore, the very concept of outcast in the medieval period was complex. Women, who might be considered outside societal norms, could also be religious recluses, powerful abbesses, or even women who adopted unconventional lifestyles. A woman fighting might have been unusual, but the sheer number of recorded instances across different regions, time periods, and social classes suggests that it was not a truly isolated or unheard of phenomenon. While it was not the expected role for most women, it happened often enough to be acknowledged, sometimes praised, sometimes condemned, but rarely dismissed as an impossibility or a sign of an individual's madness or utter societal rejection. The historical record indicates a spectrum of female involvement in combat, from indirect support to direct engagement, revealing a reality far richer and more diverse than the simple exceptional outcast myth allows. Number 2, myth women only fought out of desperation when no men were available. The idea that women only took up arms when every last man had vanished, or when their community was on the brink of total destruction, paints a picture of extreme, last-ditch desperation. This perspective suggests that women were always secondary, auxiliary figures in conflict, only stepping in as a final, unavoidable measure. However, historical accounts offer a broader range of scenarios where women engaged in combat, demonstrating motivations and circumstances that went beyond mere desperation or the complete absence of male fighters. Consider times of popular uprisings or rebellions. These movements often involved entire communities, not just the male population. Women participated actively, driven by shared grievances related to economic hardship, oppressive taxation, or political injustice. For instance, during the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, chronicles describe women playing active roles alongside men. They were involved in rioting, destruction of property, and confronting authorities. One notable figure was Johanna Fairwear, who was accused of carrying a sword and leading attacks on prisons and property in London. Her actions were not a result of a lack of men, but a direct participation in a communal uprising where both genders were present and equally invested in the revolt's aims. Such women were not merely defending their hearths from immediate threats, but engaging in proactive, collective actions aimed at social change. Women also accompanied armies on campaign, fulfilling various roles that sometimes led to direct combat. While many were laundresses, cooks, or nurses, some were also armed. The term camp follower often obscures a more complex reality. These women, sometimes wives or daughters of soldiers, lived in harsh conditions and were frequently exposed to the dangers of war. In skirmishes or ambushes, they might take up arms to defend themselves, their families, or the camp. During the Hussite Wars, as previously mentioned, entire families participated in the campaigns. The women were not just present, they formed part of the fighting force, sometimes handling wagons in the mobile fortresses known as wagonburgs and engaging directly in defensive battles alongside male fighters. This was not a situation where men were absent, but one where women were integrated into the overall military effort due to shared ideological fervor and the nature of the conflict. Furthermore, women in noble households or on estates often had responsibilities that inherently involved preparedness for conflict, even when men were present. Chatelaine, the lady of a castle, was not simply waiting for her husband to return before taking action. She commanded the garrison, oversaw defenses, and could initiate sorties or negotiations. During the Hundred Years' War, when many men were away fighting overseas, noblewomen were indeed crucial in defending their lands. But even when men were home, these women retained their authority and understanding of military matters. The defense of castles and towns was a continuous effort, not a reactive panic. Women's involvement in these defensive measures, which included managing supplies, organizing patrols, and repairing fortifications, meant they were actively involved in military readiness. And when an attack came, their direct participation in the defense was often a matter of duty and leadership, not solely desperation. They were commanders and organizers, not just last-minute fighters. Consider also instances of personal disputes or brigandage. Medieval society, particularly in rural areas, could be violent. Women might find themselves needing to defend their property, their livestock, or their personal safety from local criminals or rival families. These situations might arise when men were present, but simply not in the immediate vicinity, or when the woman was the primary person targeted. Such defensive actions were often proactive and not merely a desperate response to an overwhelming invasion. These diverse examples demonstrate that women's engagement in combat extended beyond the narrow confines of no men available. Their motivations were as varied as those of men, encompassing economic survival, political conviction, religious belief, personal defense, and communal loyalty, often occurring in contexts where male combatants were also present. Number 3, myth female warriors were just legends and literary creations. For a long time, many assumed that stories of fierce female warriors were confined to the realms of myth, epic poems, and romantic literature. Figures like the Amazons of Greek mythology or the shield maidens of Norse sagas were seen as products of imaginative storytelling, lacking any basis in historical reality. While it is true that literature often embellishes and idealizes, completely dismissing the historical presence of female combatants based on this myth overlooks a significant body of evidence that supports their real-world existence and actions. Let's begin with the Norse sagas themselves. While undoubtedly steeped in literary tradition, figures like Freydis Eriksdottir, mentioned in the Greenland Saga, are not purely fantastical. Freydis, daughter of Eric the Red, is depicted as a strong and fearless woman who participated in voyages to Vinland. In one account, during a Skrelling's Native Americans' attack, when the male Norsemen retreated, Freydis, pregnant, famously exposed her breast and struck it with a sword to frighten off the attackers. This is a dramatic, possibly exaggerated account. However, archaeological evidence from the Viking Age, particularly graves containing female remains alongside weapons, has led scholars to reevaluate the role of women in Viking society. For example, the Birka warrior woman grave, BJ 581 in Sweden, initially identified as male, was confirmed through osteological analysis to be female. And this grave contained a sword, an axe, a spear, arrows, and 2 shields, alongside a board game associated with military strategy. While not conclusive proof of direct combat, it strongly suggests a high-status woman with a significant military role, challenging the purely mythological view of shield maidens. Such finds suggest that the literary depictions, while perhaps heightened, might have had a kernel of truth in the social and martial roles of some women. Moving into the medieval period proper, concrete historical figures emerge from the chronicles, not just epic poems. One of the most striking examples is Jeanne de Clisson, known as the Lioness of Brittany. After her husband was executed by the French king in the 14th century, Jeanne sold her lands, bought 3 warships, and turned to piracy. She painted her ships black with red sails and hunted French ships in the English Channel, executing captured nobles by her own hand with an axe. Her actions were real, documented by contemporary chroniclers such as Jeanne Froissart, who described her ruthlessness and effectiveness. Jeanne de Clisson was not a myth. She was a historical figure driven by vengeance, leading her own naval forces, demonstrating military prowess and leadership in a way that directly contradicts the idea of women being purely literary creations. Another example is Agnes Hotot from the 13th century. The story goes that her father, a knight, was due to fight a duel but fell ill. Agnes, disguised in his armor, took his place and defeated her opponent. While this might sound like a romantic tale, the Hotot family in Northamptonshire reportedly incorporated a female figure into their coat of arms bearing a sword, and this story was passed down through generations. Such family traditions, while open to embellishment, often originate from a kernel of truth, serving as a proud recounting of an ancestor's real achievement. The most famous example, Joan of Arc, though often romanticized, was undeniably a historical figure. She led armies, advised generals, and was present on the battlefield during sieges and direct engagements. While her divine inspiration is a matter of faith, her historical existence and military leadership are well documented through court records, letters, and contemporary chronicles. Her story was not a legend born centuries later. It was lived and recorded by those who saw her. These examples, among others, demonstrate that while fictional literature undoubtedly presented idealized or exaggerated female warriors, real women in the medieval period did indeed participate in combat, led forces, and display martial prowess. Their stories are supported by chroniclers, legal documents, and even archaeological finds, proving that female warriors were not just a product of imagination, but a tangible, albeit perhaps less common, part of medieval reality. Number 4, myth women fighting was always considered shameful or against religious doctrine. The belief that medieval society uniformly condemned women's involvement in combat as inherently shameful or against divine will is a common misconception. While dominant societal norms certainly push women towards domestic roles and peace, and some theologians express discomfort with women in positions of power or martial activity, the reality was far more complex and often pragmatic. Attitudes varied significantly depending on the circumstances, the specific region, the social status of the woman, and the motivations behind her actions. For instance, self-defense and the defense of one's home and family were generally seen as justifiable for anyone, regardless of gender. When a community was under siege, the participation of women in its defense was often celebrated as an act of communal bravery and necessity, rather than denounced as shameful. Chroniclers often lauded the courage of women who took part in defending castles or towns. During the siege of Beauvais in 1472, Jeanne famously led women in repelling a Burgundian assault, tearing down the enemy's standard. Her actions were subsequently commemorated and celebrated, leading to a yearly procession in Beauvais where women marched first. This was not viewed as an act of shame, but of heroic defiance and patriotism. The necessity of survival often trumped abstract gender roles or theological reservations. Religious doctrine itself was not monolithic on the issue. While some interpretations of biblical texts might emphasize women's submission or roles within the household, others highlighted examples of strong, active women from the Bible, such as Deborah, Judith, or Esther, who played crucial roles in the defense of their people. Joan of Arc's example is perhaps the most powerful counterargument to the idea of universal religious condemnation. Though she faced intense scrutiny and was ultimately condemned by an English-backed ecclesiastical court, her supporters and many French clergy and nobles believed her to be divinely inspired. Her martial leadership was presented as a manifestation of God's will, not a sinful defiance of gender norms. She was even initially vetted by a group of theologians who found nothing heretical in her claims to divine guidance or her adoption of male attire for functional reasons on campaign. The debate around her was more about political power and national loyalty than a universal rejection of women in combat on religious grounds. And furthermore, medieval honor codes, particularly for the nobility, could accommodate female martial action, especially in defense of lineage or property. A noblewoman defending her castle, even if leading sorties or engaging in direct command, was often viewed as upholding her family's honor and protecting her inherited lands, rather than disgracing herself. Her actions would be seen as a fulfillment of her duty as a chatelaine. The Countess of Montfort's actions during the Breton War of Succession were not condemned as unwomanly, but admired for their bravery and loyalty to her husband's cause. Such women were often celebrated as viragos, a term which, while sometimes carrying negative connotations, could also imply a woman possessing manly virtues, strength, and courage, rather than a shameful aberration. The perception also depended on the type of fighting. While a woman joining a professional army might be highly unusual and sometimes seen as transgressive, a woman defending her home or participating in a community uprising due to shared grievances was often viewed differently. The shame often lay not in the act of fighting itself, but in transgressing established social order or modesty outside of perceived necessity. Ultimately, the medieval view on women in combat was a complex interplay of societal expectations, pragmatic realities, religious interpretations, and individual circumstances, far from a blanket condemnation of all martial women as shameful or religiously deviant. Number 5. Myth: medieval women received no formal combat training. The notion that medieval women were entirely devoid of formal combat training is a pervasive myth. It stems from the assumption that martial arts were an exclusively male domain, and that women were never exposed to or instructed in the use of weapons or defensive tactics. While it is true that systematic professional military training was predominantly for men destined for knighthood or soldiering, the reality for medieval women was more varied and often dictated by their social standing, geographic location, and the necessities of their lives. For noblewomen, the management of a household and estate, especially in the absence of their husbands, frequently involved an understanding of defensive strategies and the command of a garrison. As daughters of knights and nobles grew up in environments where weapons were commonplace and martial exercises were part of daily life. While they might not have trained as squires did, they observed, learned about strategy, and understood the practicalities of defense. Many noblewomen were taught to ride horses, often side saddle, but sometimes astride, a skill essential for travel and potentially for evasion or rallying troops. Some sources, particularly from later medieval periods, suggest that some noble girls might have received basic instruction in arms for self-defense or as part of a broader education in estate management. For example, the martial education of Christine de Peasant, a 14th century writer, described how she was educated in a way that gave her a broader understanding of military matters, though not direct combat training. However, noble women overseeing castle defenses needed to understand the capabilities of their men at arms, the strengths and weaknesses of fortifications, and how to organize supplies and patrols. And this required a practical, albeit indirect, form of military education. Beyond the nobility, necessity often became a harsh but effective teacher. As women living in frontier regions, areas prone to raiding, or during prolonged periods of warfare, frequently had to defend themselves and their families. This might not have been formal training in the modern sense, but it was hands-on, practical instruction driven by survival. As peasant women, accustomed to hard physical labor, were often strong and capable. They learned to use agricultural tools as weapons, or to handle basic implements like knives, clubs, or stones for self-defense against bandits or marauders. Their training came from lived experience and the immediacy of threat. Specific examples illustrate this point. The accounts of women participating in sieges, as mentioned in previous myths, often describe them throwing stones, pouring hot liquids, or engaging in direct combat with whatever was at hand. This level of participation suggests some degree of familiarity with the mechanics of defense and offense, even if learned on the spot. While not formal, this was practical, ad hoc training. Furthermore, medieval legal documents and societal norms sometimes acknowledged a woman's right to defend herself and her property, implying a societal understanding that women could, and sometimes would, engage in physical resistance. While not an endorsement of general military training, it was a recognition of their capacity for defensive action. While systematic, professional martial training like that of knights was indeed exclusive to men, denying women any form of combat training overlooks the informal, circumstantial, and necessity-driven learning that occurred across all social strata. From noblewomen managing garrisons and understanding siegecraft, to peasant women defending their homes with farm implements, medieval women were often exposed to, and sometimes trained in, the practicalities of defense and the use of weapons, defying the blanket assertion of no formal combat training. Number 6, myth women could not handle heavy medieval weapons or armor. The idea that medieval women were too delicate or physically incapable of wielding heavy medieval weapons or wearing full-plate armor is a persistent myth, often based on modern misconceptions about both medieval life and female physiology. This myth ignores the physical realities of medieval existence and the historical evidence of women who clearly demonstrated the necessary strength and endurance. Firstly, medieval life was incredibly demanding for everyone, men and women alike. Most people engaged in strenuous physical labor daily, whether in agriculture, crafts, or household management. Women were often involved in heavy tasks like milling grain, carrying water, tending livestock, and performing physically demanding chores that built significant strength and endurance. The notion of medieval women as universally frail and sedentary is largely inaccurate. Secondly, medieval armor and weapons, while substantial, were designed for functionality and distribution of weight. A full suit of plate armor from the late medieval period, while appearing cumbersome, was expertly articulated and distributed its weight across the entire body, allowing for surprisingly fluid movement. A complete suit of 15th century plate armor weighed between 45 and 65 pounds, 20 to 30 kg, which is roughly the weight of a modern soldier's combat load, including body armor and equipment. While this is certainly heavy, it was not beyond the capacity of a fit individual. Numerous historical accounts describe women wearing armor. Joan of Arc famously wore full plate armor in battle. Her armor, made specifically for her, would have been tailored to her physique, demonstrating that it was perfectly possible for a woman to be fully armored. Other noblewomen, like Eleanor of Aquitaine's participation in the Second Crusade, though not necessarily in direct combat, suggest women riding alongside knights and enduring the physical rigors of campaign, sometimes clad in protective gear. When it comes to weapons, the common armaments were varied. Swords, spears, axes, and bows came in many weights and sizes. A one-handed sword might weigh only 2 to 3 pounds, around 1 kg, while a larger two-handed sword could be 5 to 8 pounds, 2.2 to 3.6 kg. Spears and axes, while perhaps longer or having a heavier head, were designed to be wielded effectively. It is not accurate to imagine all medieval weapons as excessively heavy. Many were quite manageable. Accounts of peasant women defending themselves often mention them using improvised weapons like scythes, clubs, or pitchforks, which are farm tools requiring considerable strength to use effectively. If women could handle these implements in their daily lives, they could certainly use them in combat. Archaeological evidence also provides insights. Skeletal remains of medieval women sometimes show signs of physical trauma consistent with conflict, or bone development indicating habitual heavy labor. While direct evidence of women wielding specific weapons or armor from archaeological sites is rare, the overall physical capability indicated by skeletal analysis challenges the assumption of universal female physical weakness. The myth of female physical incapacity for medieval combat is often a projection of modern stereotypes. Historical evidence suggests that many medieval women possessed the necessary strength, endurance, and practical knowledge to handle the weapons and armor of their time, either for self-defense, community defense, or direct military action, effectively busting this widely held belief. Number 7. Myth women only defended castles in desperate sieges. The popular image of medieval women in combat often restricts them to the passive role of defending a besieged castle, usually as a last resort when all other options have failed. This narrative suggests that women's military involvement was purely defensive, reactive, and confined to the walls of their homes. However, historical records reveal that women engaged in a much broader spectrum of military activities, including leading offensive actions, participating in field battles, and even commanding troops beyond their fortifications. One of the most compelling examples of a woman initiating offensive action is Jeanne de Clisson, the Lioness of Brittany. As previously mentioned, after her husband's execution, she did not merely retreat to a castle to await attack. Instead, she actively raised a force, purchased warships, and launched an aggressive campaign of piracy against French vessels. Her actions were entirely offensive, driven by vengeance, and involved direct command of her fleet, raiding and engaging enemy ships at sea. This was a proactive and aggressive campaign far removed from the defensive posture of a besieged castle. Another powerful figure, the Countess of Montfort, Jeanne de Penthièvre, during the Breton War of Succession in the 14th century, is well documented for her active military leadership. While she did famously defend Hennebont Castle, her involvement was not limited to passive defense. She reportedly led sorties from the castle walls, riding out with her forces to attack the besiegers. She also traveled through her lands, rallying support, raising troops, and engaging in strategic maneuvers to defend her husband's claim. Her actions were often proactive, demonstrating a full understanding of offensive and defensive military strategy. Women also participated in pitched battles and skirmishes outside of castle walls. While not commonplace, chronicles occasionally mention women fighting alongside men in field engagements, particularly during popular uprisings or religious wars. The Hussite Wars in Bohemia in the 15th century offer numerous accounts of women not just defending fortresses but marching with armies, participating in field engagements, and contributing directly to the fighting force. Their involvement was integral to the Hussite military strategy, which often involved mobile wagon fort formations that could be used defensively or offensively. Women were recorded maintaining these fortifications and engaging in direct combat within and around them during battles. Furthermore, women sometimes led troops on campaign. While Joan of Arc is the most prominent example, leading armies to relieve sieges and engage in open battle, other less famous instances exist. Noblewomen, when acting as regents or commanders of their estates, might dispatch their retinues to engage in skirmishes or punitive expeditions against rivals or bandits. This was an exercise of their authority and an offensive use of their military capacity, not merely a defensive reaction. These examples clearly demonstrate that the idea of women only fighting defensively within castle walls is a simplification. Medieval women, driven by a range of motivations from vengeance to religious zeal to political ambition, engaged in various forms of military action, including leading offensive campaigns, participating in field battles, and commanding troops in active strategic roles. Number 8. Myth women only fought disguised as men. The idea that any medieval woman who engaged in combat must have done so in disguise, pretending to be a man, is a very persistent myth. This narrative suggests that women could not fight openly as themselves and had to resort to deception to participate in warfare. While some women certainly did adopt male disguise for practical or social reasons, a significant number of historical accounts describe women fighting openly, as women, without any attempt to hide their gender. One of the most famous figures associated with male disguise is Joan of Arc. She wore male clothing and armor, which was a point of contention during her trial. However, Joan's reasons for wearing male attire were complex, and she herself explained them as practical, easier for riding, movement, and preventing assault, and by divine instruction. She was not trying to pass as a man in the sense of deceiving everyone around her. Her identity as a woman, the maid, was widely known and central to her public persona. Her male attire was an exception to typical female dress, not a total concealment of her gender, which was openly discussed and even glorified by her followers. In contrast to Joan, many women fought openly as women, particularly in defensive roles or popular uprisings. During sieges, women on castle walls or city ramparts were often observed by attackers and chroniclers without any mention of disguise. Their participation was often in their normal attire, perhaps reinforced for protection. Accounts of women throwing stones, pouring hot tar, or engaging in direct hand-to-hand combat during sieges frequently describe them as women, not as disguised men. For instance, the women of Beauvais, led by Jeanne, were clearly identified as women fighting in their own defense. Their actions were celebrated precisely because they were women bravely defending their city. Peasant women involved in local skirmishes or popular revolts also rarely seem to have adopted male disguise. They participated as members of their community, using whatever tools or improvised weapons were available, and their gender was not concealed. The accounts of women involved in the Peasants' Revolt in England, or the Hussite Wars, speak of them fighting alongside men as women, often without specific mention of disguise. They were recognized for their gender and their participation in the conflict. And furthermore, noblewomen who led their retinues or defended their estates, such as the Countess of Montfort, did so in their capacity as ladies of the castle or powerful nobles. They did not disguise themselves to command troops or to inspire their forces. They did so openly, as women in positions of authority. Their leadership was acknowledged and often praised precisely because they were powerful women taking on traditionally male roles. The reasons for adopting male disguise when it occurred were varied. Sometimes it was for practical mobility, especially when traveling long distances or avoiding unwanted attention. Other times, it might have been for personal safety, to avoid gender-specific violence during chaotic times. However, it was, by no means, a universal requirement for women to participate in combat. Many women fought as themselves, demonstrating their courage and capability without any attempt to hide their identity, providing a much more nuanced picture of female involvement in medieval warfare than the disguised warrior myth suggests. Number 9. Myth medieval women were never involved in combat roles. The belief that medieval women were entirely absent from combat, confined solely to domestic duties while men handled all military matters, is perhaps the most pervasive and inaccurate myth about their role in the Middle Ages. This idea paints a picture of a rigidly gender-segregated society where women had no place on the battlefield or in any martial capacity. However, historical evidence from across the entire medieval period, from the early Middle Ages to the late, conclusively shows that women were indeed involved in various combat roles, from direct fighting to strategic command. One prominent area of female involvement was in the defense of castles and fortified towns during sieges. While this is sometimes acknowledged, its true extent and the level of direct participation are often underestimated. Women, whether noblewomen or commoners, played active and often critical roles. They were responsible for maintaining morale, caring for the wounded, and often took up arms themselves. They threw stones and projectiles from battlements, poured boiling water or hot pitch on attackers, and sometimes even engaged in direct hand-to-hand combat if a breach occurred. The 12th century siege of Carcassonne saw women helping to defend the walls. The 15th century siege of Beauvais, already mentioned, is a prime example where Jeanne led women to repulse a Burgundian assault, using an axe to fight. These were not isolated incidents, but a recurring theme in medieval siege warfare, where every able-bodied person contributed to the defense. Beyond static defense, women also participated in broader military operations, sometimes even leading them. Noble women, acting as regents or chatelaines, frequently found themselves in positions of military command. They oversaw garrisons, issued orders for defense, managed supplies, and even initiated or joined military campaigns. The Countess of Montfort, Jeanne de Penthièvre, actively led her forces during the Breton War of Succession in the 14th century. She rode fully armored, rallied her troops, and conducted offensive sorties against besieging forces. Her leadership was not just administrative, it was active and direct. Women were also involved in popular uprisings and localized conflicts. During peasant revolts or urban unrest, women often fought alongside men, driven by shared grievances or the need to defend their communities. Accounts from the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 describe women participating in the violence, including figures like Johanna Farrower, who was accused of carrying a sword and leading attacks. Similarly, during the Hussite Wars in 15th century Bohemia, women were an integral part of the fighting forces. They manned the mobile fortresses, wagenburgs, fought with various weapons, and shared the hardships and dangers of campaigning. Their participation was often driven by religious fervor and communal solidarity. Furthermore, some women achieved renown as individual warriors or leaders. While Joan of Arc is the most iconic example leading French armies to victory against the English, her story, though unique in its divine claims, was not the only instance of a woman commanding troops. Jeanne de Clisson, the lioness of Brittany from the 14th century, took to the seas as a pirate, leading a fleet against French shipping in an act of vengeance. She personally oversaw the execution of captured French nobles. While not the majority of combatants, these examples clearly show that women were present in various capacities, from defending their homes to leading armies and engaging in direct combat. Their involvement was often dictated by necessity, social status, and personal conviction, demonstrating a far more active and diverse role in medieval warfare than the long-standing myth of complete absence suggests.